Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kratom Sobriety Podcast. I'm Jacob, and I'm here with my excellent co-host, Chris. Chris, how are things?
Good, Jacob. Can't complain over here. Just getting in the October mood.
Nice. It's starting to get cold here. Have the windows open, but had to put on a sweatshirt because it's a little chilly out. But
I know I'm
we'll
wearing a
we'll
hoodie
manage.
too. It's hoodie weather.
It definitely is. This week's guest is Jay, who Chris interviewed. I'll let her speak a little bit about what you can expect from that one.
Yeah, Jay has a very interesting story to tell about his use of Kratom, getting off of Kratom, what that looked like. He's also a big Stephen King fan. It's just a really interesting story. Excited for everyone to hear it.
Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be a really interesting story. Excited to hear it as well. Okay, so today we were going to discuss a voicemail that we got from a listener. So I'm going to read it and then we can talk a little bit about it. I'm going to omit the guest name, but we received a voicemail from a concerned mother, and it states, I found your podcast this morning. I really would love to speak with you or get some advice for my son. 23, he overdosed on Kratom Thursday night. My ex-husband had to perform CPR on him while the EMTs came. They revived him with Narcan, and he spent the night in the ER. And of course, he's back home now, feels fine, is doing great, and he's got this, is what he's saying. Trying to understand if he really can do this on his own with help of podcasts and websites that you recommend. He's committed to doing outpatient, but we're concerned that we really like to see him do inpatient treatment. I'd really love your thoughts on that. Thank you. Lot to unpack there.
Yeah, lots to unpack. I have a lot of initial thoughts. One, I'm glad that she found the podcast, and I'm glad that he's doing okay. That's so scary.
Yes. Yeah, that was my first thought too.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm seeing more stories like that in the news about people overdosing on Kratom, and yeah, I'm glad he's okay. That was my first thought. And yeah,
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
was
there's a lot
similar.
to unpack there. What are your thoughts?
I think you can definitely beat a kratom addiction with the help of a outpatient program, meetings, podcasts, therapy. Definitely can be done. It's hard to give more advice too because I don't know the backstory. I don't know if this is like he just used an extract and never did this before, or if this has been a thing and it's been like a cascading increasing addiction, or if this was the first time this happened and there's been medical scares. I will say that my initial thought is if you are young, you don't have a lot of responsibilities, you have the money and you have the time and you can do inpatient, and you could put this behind you and build a solid life, I would probably do it if I could go back in time. A lot of people don't have that luxury, and I know that probably the last thing you want to do as a 23-year-old, but at the same time, with the benefit of hindsight and a long, lengthy addiction, I can totally see how that would be a privilege, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. I just thinking, because obviously I don't know the backstory either. First, I want to tell her and him that you're not alone. We are here for you, rooting you on, whatever you decide. And there's a huge community out there of people specifically in Kratom, recovery from Kratom. You can find a lot of groups online specifically for support during Kratom recovery. But just in my personal opinion, just thinking back on, because I did go to rehab for Kratom, and it seemed like such a big chunk of time. I had to spend a month away from my son. I was like, it's a whole month like of my life. That's such a lot of time to give up. I know that, and unfortunately I did relapse after rehab. That's because I didn't take the resources I got seriously. But it gives you such valuable tools, and it removes you from the situation temporarily. Unfortunately, Kratom's everywhere, at least where I live. It's in gas stations, it's in vape shops and smoke shops. Being removed from a temptation for 30 days was very beneficial. Being in an environment that specifically was about recovery all the time and was specifically meant to give me tools for recovery was beneficial. And 30 days of recovery is nothing compared to a lifetime off of that stuff. If you can spend 30 days getting the tools you need and then move on from that stuff, then I think it's a sacrifice worth taking. And that's just my opinion. I'm a huge proponent of whatever works for you. But just thinking back, I think going to rehab was an inpatient rehab was the good move for me.
Yeah. I also have to it's hard. I'm not a doctor too, so I really probably shouldn't give this advice, but asking my opinion, I would also say the other factor is I don't know what this woman's son's substance abuse history looks like, not just with Kratom, but with other things. And I've seen this kind of worrisome pattern where I've seen a lot of people that have a very long term Kratom addiction now that have come from like opiates or other things. And it's interesting because they like relapse so many times, but they're not willing to. And I'm speaking just generally because I see these posts on Reddit all the time, on Facebook groups. I tapered before, I quit cold turkey before, so I'm just going to do that again. And that's all. I just got to get through these withdrawals. I'm not saying that's what your son is doing. I don't know, and this is a bit off topic now. But where I'm going with this is I think the benefits of, even with the outpatient, they will look at your overall history. And for some people, if this is a person that was using extracts heavily and has a history of pills or fentanyl or something like that, and after an incident like this, you're at heightened risk for that happening again, it could be safer to maybe be on some sort of medication assisted treatment like Vivitrol or even Suboxone if that's warranted. Those are other things that could be helpful, but it's really hard to know with limited information.
Yeah, I think just a couple other questions to ask that come to mind that might be helpful. The why of the use. I know I was using because I was self-medicating, and when I went to treatment, they were able to put me on medication for depression, medication for anxiety. And so having those kind of fixed, and I started therapy there. So yeah, it's not just about getting off the Kratom and detoxing from the Kratom. It's also about figuring out why you were using the Kratom and replacing those with healthier solutions. So those are just some thoughts that come to mind. There are so many positive ways to go about getting off the Kratom, and it's not a one size fits all solution.
I agree. The last thing I'll say on this is there's 3 words in the voicemail that are a little worrisome for me, and those are "he's got this." So my favorite alcohol recovery podcast is Recovery Elevator. I plug it too much on this podcast, but the host always says the worst thing an addict can say, the worst 3 words an addict can say are "I got this," because you don't. You think you do, but even I don't. You need a community to help you. You just do. There are those random weirdo people, not weirdo, there's random people that can do it on their own with no help and no support and just drop a substance and move on. They are what we would call a unicorn. They rarely exist. And if you find one, I would question them heavily for trying to find holes in their story because I still don't even believe it. So that's just my final thought on the matter, I think.
Yeah, those stood out to me too. I've heard that phrase a lot, and it's because in the past I have said, "I've got this."
Oh, I have so many times.
Then I relapse. Yeah. This last go around, I was very careful to realize that I didn't have it at all and I needed help. And I think that's one of the biggest. And I needed help from other addicts or from people who had knowledge of addiction. And I don't want this mom to be discouraged by that at all. The best thing she can do is love her son and support him. And I appreciated the support of my parents so much. But what really helped me was getting in rooms, getting in conversations with other people in recovery who really understood what I was going through and could help in that way.
Yeah, I think that's all good advice. And just for the mom, if you're out there listening to this, your son agreeing to do outpatient is huge, even if you can't, if you ultimately determine or he's just not willing to do the in-person. I don't know the whole history, so can't say if it's warranted or not. But I think even if he's truly commits to the IOP and does the recovery work, that could be a great way for him to ensure that he doesn't find himself in this type of situation again.
Yeah, we're here for you. We're here for him. We're cheering both of you on. And that's all I got.
All right. With that, thank you for reaching out. And if there are others out there that are listening that have questions or want to get in touch with us, feel free to email or call or text. All that stuff will be posted in the show notes as usual in our socials. And with that, we'll get on to the interview with Jay. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kratom Sobriety Podcast. My name is Chris, and tonight I'm very excited to be talking with Jay. Jay, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to hear your story. But first, before we talk about Kratom at all, how would you describe yourself to a stranger meeting you for the first time?
Well, I would say I am a 43-year-old, just average guy. I work as a consultant for an insurance company, and I am married, have 2 adult children and 1 almost adult child. Like to hang out with them and my dog Lucy, and that's about me. Yeah.
And you're a Stephen King fan. I have to point that out because I'm very excited about that. I am too. And it's October. So it's a good time to talk
Yes.
about Stephen King, I think.
It's always a good time to talk about Stephen King, but
That's
yes,
right.
I agree. And he's a fellow sober person, so that's always a plus.
It's a huge plus. Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
have a favorite? Not to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite Stephen King book?
I do, and it's a lot of people's favorite. Pet Cemetery is actually the one that hits the hardest. As a father, I think the movie, at least the original 80s movie, was, it's a great horror movie, but that novel is so much more. It's one of the best dissections of grief and loss that I've ever read. And yeah, so that's that one and his book On Writing are my favorites.
Oh, that's interesting that you say On
Yeah.
Writing. I like
Yes.
that. I've never heard anyone say that as a favorite.
Oh, it's great. And it's the one that I've reread the most, for sure. I think his ability to tell stories and then relate it back to his development and evolution as a writer is, I write for fun. And so I've always been inspired by his books anyway. So hearing him talk about it, it's good stuff.
Well, I could talk about Stephen King probably for this whole episode, but why don't we jump into your journey with Kratom? So, when did Kratom first enter your life?
So it was 2018, but before that, I've struggled with addiction my entire life, go back to teenage years, and it has changed faces in different substances many times. Alcohol was kind of the consistent one that was always there. I tend to, and this plays into how Kratom comes along, I also tend to like doing things that are more secretive, that other people don't know about, that I can do and they won't know. So while, I was drinking and doing other drugs, I was also, back in the early 2000s, I started doing like I guess you could call it trucker speed and like stuff at the gas stations. So I would do that. And then I went through a period where I started abusing DXM. Are you familiar with that?
A little bit, but for our listeners, why don't you just give a definition of that?
That's the ingredient that is in Robitussin and Coricidin and other cold medicines. And it is a dissociative type of drug that I started taking. Again, it was something I could secretly do that people didn't know about. And if you take a little more than you should, it can have pretty strong effects, but like I did with Kratom and everything else, that quickly escalated to where, I was secretly taking 2 boxes of cold medicine a day, and it spiraled out of control. And so I went through just different periods in my addiction where I would be secretly using something until it completely consumed me. And I was having a lot of health issues because of it. I was having inpatient stays in the hospital, pancreatitis because of my drinking and other things. And finally, after pancreatitis in June of 2017, I was finally like, I can't do this anymore. I've got to stop drinking. And at that point, I wasn't doing anything else other than the alcohol. And for 30 days, I white knuckled it, and it was absolutely miserable. Just every day.
From the alcohol? Wait, knuckling
Yes.
it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it was 24/7 just thinking about how can I figure out a way to do this and nobody will know. And thinking, and also, again, thinking of what other substance could I find that I could secretly do and pretend that I'm still sober. And like I said, that lasted for 30 days. And then I was talking to my wife and decided, hey, maybe I could just start smoking pot again. Pot's pretty innocuous, it seems like, so I could just do that. And again, it played into my secretive thing because I could hide that from my work people, and I could do it in the evenings. But history always repeats itself, and so that turned into 24/7 smoking pot. And so then that was just my baseline. And so when that's just my baseline, that leads me to I start doing benzos. And then I'm at a gas station sometime in 2018. I can't remember that exact date. And I'm looking at these pills that are in a little plastic bag, and it says Kratom. And I'm pick it up, and the guy behind the counter is like, hey, that's new. People are really liking it. They're coming in and getting it. And he's telling me about how this one is, more uplifting, and giving me a little spiel that you get from a guy working at a gas station. So
I think a lot of people can relate to that, the gas station spiel.
Yeah. And I hadn't heard about it, or at least not much. And so, I, of course, got some of it and secretly tried it. And I was like, hey, this is actually doing something. Because there was that feeling, I was, when you buy stuff at head shops, gas stations, things like that, sometimes you get something and it's like, oh, well, this doesn't do anything. Especially if you're someone who has done lots of drugs and stuff over your whole life, you get it and you're like, yeah, this isn't anything. But it actually did something.
Do you remember how much you took when you first started taking it?
I don't. Probably like, I don't know, 8 pills or capsules or something. And actually, I never did the liquid. But by the time I stopped, I was still, using powder and capsules, and just taking lots of those. Like I did the same thing with it that I did Coracetin and other things, where it was just the routine where I would take a big dose in the morning and then go to work. And then when work was over, I would take the same big dose that I took that morning. And the whole while, I was, smoking weed and doing benzos. Those last few years, that was just my routine. And when COVID hit and lockdown came along, then it just escalated even more, because, I had years and years of drinking and doing other things in the office at my job. But now, I was just sitting at home. So it was easier. And yeah.
Were you still doing it secretly? Was that still a secret thing
It
that you
was.
did?
And I think with myself, part of the thing that I loved about my addictions and my drug usage and stuff was that secretive thing. I liked having this thing that I did. It's something that through recovery and my sobriety that, in therapy, I've done a lot of looking at my behaviors, and there was just a lot of, I really liked the, sense of power, almost, of like having something that other people didn't know about. I also talk about this sometimes. I got sober in 2022, but I had quit drinking in 2017. For a long time there, people didn't even know that I was smoking weed. They thought I was just completely sober. And so I remember being really pompous, kind of asshole, when people that I knew that were sober, like in recovery communities and stuff, and they'd be like, so you just quit drinking? And I was like, well, yeah, I just put it down. I just knew it wasn't healthy, so I just quit doing it, secretly high while I'm telling them this. It brought out all of the, worst character flaws in myself and just fed them, for sure.
Were you going to AA meetings and still working a program around your sobriety from alcohol at this time?
No, I wasn't. And I have few friends, and especially at that time, one of my best friends had been in a program for ever, and had tried to get me to go to meetings, and I was always very resistant to it. Because I was putting up the front that, well, I don't need it. I just was able to stop on my own. So why would I need to go do any work on myself? So no, at that time I was not.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the progression of the Kratom, but one thing you said that I totally relate to is the replacing substances with other substances. I still work on that. I mean, I got out of rehab last summer for Kratom.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately, I hadn't had a problem with alcohol before the Kratom, and I immediately had a problem with alcohol because I knew I couldn't use the Kratom. I was being drug tested for the Kratom by people who loved me,
Yeah.
but I knew I could drink and I could probably get away with that. And so that became a huge problem. And even now, I have a few months sober from everything. I don't drink anymore. I don't use Kratom, but still I find my mind sometimes being like, well, like what could I use?
Right.
Yeah. So I relate to that very much.
I was talking to someone the other weekend, and they're California sober, and that works for them. And whatever will work for you, do that. Like, if you can be healthy and productive and okay, then that's great. But my history has taught me that I can't handle anything. So I know myself, and I know where I go when I start doing something. And so I really just always have to keep an eye on, if I have a feeling of, I want to do something, then I need to look at, wait, why? Like, why do I need to do something? Like, why is it not okay what I'm feeling right now? And, we talk about, in recovery and in the sober community, like triggers and everything. And triggers are absolutely a real thing. But I remember being in rehab and working with a therapist about what my triggers were. And the more I looked at my list of triggers, the more I was like, I'm giving myself excuses a little bit here, because like boredom, like, yeah, boredom is a trigger. But then I'm like, well, I was using 24/7. I was using when I was bored. I was using when I was busy. I was using when I was at work, when I was at home, when I was at family functions. Like, trigger for me was simply waking up and existing. The issue is I couldn't stand being with myself. And so I was looking for any way out of that. So now when I start feeling like something would be nice to do right now, it's like, wait, why? Like, why am I not okay being just me, like, right now?
No, I totally relate to that. That's exactly, whenever I have those feelings, my sponsor told me to take it as information and just, if I'm like, oh, I really want to use something right now, instead of feeding that thought and running with it, just stepping back and being like, that's interesting information. Like, why do I feel that right now? Because my mind can just take that and just hold on to it and run with it. And
it's that obsessive thinking. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's the pandemic. You're using a ton of Kratom, a lot of Kratom, and you're doing it secretly. When do you start to realize that it's an issue, that it's something you don't think serves you anymore?
Fairly quickly. I have brief intervals where I would, and by brief, I'm a week or something, where I would not take it, where I would stop. And when I would stop, it was usually because my stomach would have gotten messed up again, and I would just have stomach cramps and pains, and then I would stop, and I would have trouble sleeping, start having these things that, from my previous addictions and stuff, I'm like, okay, well, I'm withdrawing from this already. And in my mind, it's like, oh, well, I went a week, I can jump back in now. And, and I think maybe I'll be able to take less, and it'll still work. And maybe for that day, that would work. Yeah, I would always be right back to whatever level I was at that point when I had quit.
Did anyone ever question your use of it or find out about it?
It was one of those things retroactively. Yeah, I would get a chronic long-term cough. I would just have this cough, and obviously coming through COVID, that was awful. And so I remember she didn't know it was because of Kratom, but it kept being that trigger to where her or my daughter would be asking, like, wait, do you think you have COVID? You're coughing again. And I'd be like, oh, no, it's fine. They said, no, you were coughing yesterday too. I remember having to be really on guard. And I can remember many times sitting there thinking like, oh no, don't cough. Like, how can you hide this cough? Yeah. So yeah, there was that going on again, like, and it goes back to other substances that I use that would, start having dilated pupils all the time, and my wife would learn like, okay, that's this substance, because it would always end the same. Like at some point something would happen and I would get caught with whatever drug it was at the time, and then she would learn, okay, I need to be looking for this now. And so I would have to modify and find a different substance to use, or a different hiding spot for things. That's something that throughout my usage, all the different places that, I would get caught and say, okay, well, this, you've found me out. And yes, that's where I hide things, like behind the thing on that bookshelf. So all that meant was, okay, well, now I'm inventing a new hiding place somewhere. And it again goes back to that hiding and secretive thing that, is this game I was playing with myself, essentially.
So when did you decide that, because you said you went to rehab partly for Kratom. When did you decide that was the decision you wanted to make, or the path you wanted to take?
So the last year, I'd say the last year and a half of my usage, I was so isolated and so insular and just getting very unhealthy in every aspect of my life. But I started making very poor decisions that I would not make as some form of more sober than I was at that time. Yeah, I was doing very damaging things with my family, and I was hurting them. It goes into, again, to the secretive nature of my disease, and things kind of blew up at home about a year before I got sober. And I remember, my wife asking me to leave, and I left the house, and I remember getting a mile away and having to turn around and come back, because while I was driving off, I realized, I left a couple bottles of Kratom. And I was like, I need to get back and get them because I need to use them. And also I don't want her to find them there. And like I said, that was about a year before everything. So at that point, I thought, okay, things are going poorly. I need to act like I'm getting my shit together and do better, but I still continued with bad decisions, poor behavior. I came home and I was again hiding everything I was doing, and she still didn't know about the Kratom. And my wife also has her own struggles that she's dealt with, and so she went actually to a facility to work on some of her own issues. And while she was there, I remember talking to her saying like, do you think you might have an issue with drinking? And I was totally projecting my own issues onto her. And when she got back out, it was very unhealthy. Like, I wanted her to get better and I wanted her to be better, but with her being better, then it just made me feel like even worse. And so I think I just got in a really bad spiral, like a self-destructive thing. And then again, everything blew up at home. Everything blew up at work. I was standing in my front yard and my wife was literally like throwing my stuff out the front door into the yard. And I was just like, oh my God, this is that cliche. Like, this is the thing I've seen in movies, I've read in books. Like, I'm actually living this now. And my kids are in there like helping her box stuff up. And I remember when that was happening, I went to the garage and got my stash box. put it in the front seat, and I might as well have buckled it up like to protect it, because my life is like on fire in front of me, and I'm making sure that I have my drugs. I think a bottom is a nice marker in a story afterwards, but it's a made up thing. Like, I had plenty of bottoms that should have been the moment. I mean, the hospitalizations, the getting arrested, the things that happened, it wasn't enough. Like, something finally, I don't know what it was specifically, but I was out of the house again, and I was laying in the like twin bed in my bedroom. I'm 41, and I'm in my childhood bed at my parents' house, and I was laying there, and I wasn't. I was calling in at work because, like I said, it blown stuff up there, so I was not wanting to go to the office. I was just in that room again, and I remember thinking, like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is, it is what it's always been, for the last, I don't know, 26 years of, this is substances. Like, I'm still doing this. And so at that point, I thought, I threw my hands up and just said, fuck it. Please, somebody tell me what to do, because I don't know what to do. And I called the number for this facility in town, and I, asked them. I was like, I don't know. I think I might need to go to rehab. And so they did the, evaluation, and they said, yeah, come in tomorrow morning. And so,
Wow.
yeah, I went in, and, at that point, like I said, I had spent my whole life trying to do it my own way and make my own decisions. And, I was 41. My family wasn't wanting to talk to me, and I was in rehab. And so I was, we talk about the gift of desperation. At that point, I was like, yeah, just please, someone help me out here. What do I do?
Yeah, I relate to the bottoms thing. A lot of people would always ask me, like, is this your bottom? What was your bottom? Like, when did you reach your bottom? I had so many bottoms. I mean, I can't really pinpoint one thing that made me get sober at the end, other than that I was just desperate. I had tried so many times on my own, and I just was like, finally realized, like, I have no idea how to do this, and I'm desperate for someone to tell me what to do to fix this. So you're in rehab. Did you tell them, did they know that Kratom was the thing that you were coming in for?
So the people in intake, in that evaluation area, they knew about it. Some of the like techs and nurses there knew about it. Some did not. Like, some, I had to kind of explain to them what it was. But I remember going in there, I was really embarrassed that's why I was in there. I felt some imposter syndrome at first, and was like, oh my gosh, I don't want them to find out that I'm here because of, gas station dope, which was something I hadn't heard until one of the texts. He was like, oh, you're on that gas station dope. I said,
oh my gosh. Yep.
I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, yeah. So some of them were aware. I mean, this was April 8th of 22. So at that point, some knew, but yeah, not ever. And I was really surprised to find out that there were a couple other people in there who weren't, solely in there for that, but they were, that was one of their substances they were in there for.
Yeah, I wish I would have been more honest when I went to rehab about what I was there for, because I always say, looking back, that no one else was there for Kratom, but I don't know, because I wasn't too open about what I was there for, because I was embarrassed. Yeah. It's so like sad, but I felt like if people knew I was in rehab for Kratom, they wouldn't think that my withdrawals had been horrible. They would, I don't know. It was just a very weird thing. But looking back on it, and I kind of still do that. I mean, I make sure people know, like, it was bad. Like, it was really bad. You know, I did a lot of crazy stuff. I was definitely addicted to it. I don't know. I hate that I do that because it is, as this podcast shows, there are so many people that have a really difficult journey with it. So,
For sure. Yeah. It's starting to get more notice now. And that's why I think this podcast is so important, because so many people don't know about it, or don't know that there's a community of other people like them out there. And when it comes to addiction, it's such an isolating thing. You feel like you're alone. And so to find out that, oh, okay, I'm not the only person who has this issue. I remember when I went into rehab, I really, at that point in my life, the way I like to say it is, I felt like I was a very, very unique and delicate flower that nobody else understood. Nobody felt the way I felt. Nobody thought the way I thought. And then it was the first night. I was sitting in the common area. People were talking. They had an impromptu meeting. People started sharing, and I was blown away when all of a sudden people in this room were saying the things that I thought I was so unique for feeling. I was like, that person is saying the crazy thing that I think. And it was huge. And so then when people started coming in and talking to us that had put together some time of sobriety, and I was hearing them, I think that's when things started changing, like in my head, because up to that point, my experience with any sobriety was that 30-day period of white knuckling it and obsessing and hating it. And so all of a sudden I'm hearing people tell me that you can get sober and you can get to a point where you're not thinking about it all the time, where you're not obsessed with it. When I heard that from people who were like me, and not people that, not some sober person, not a health professional telling me that I could get better, but someone who had the same thing telling me I've done this, then I was like, oh, okay. And so that's when I started having hope, and I hadn't had that in a long time.
So that started when you were in rehab?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So did you hear the stories of the other people in rehab who also had some kind of problem with Kratom?
Not much. No, just people saying, oh yeah, I use that some, not people that were like me that were, doing it a lot.
Right.
That was one of the reasons I was in there. But 2.5 years since I got sober, in that time, like, I've started encountering it more and more. When I go back and talk to people in those, facilities, like it's becoming something that is, the more popular it gets, and the more people are going to be, coming into those places.
Right. And it seems like they're always coming out with new products, stronger products. So unfortunately, I think we're just going to see it become more and more of a problem. And it's sold in gas stations, you know? So, okay. So you get out of rehab. Oh, and what is your official, do you know what your official clean date is for everyone listening?
April 8th, 2022.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you have more, so you do have like 2.5 years almost.
Yep.
Yeah. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it blows my mind. Every once in a while, I will think about it. And I'm like, that is so many days where I didn't need to get out of my own head. And like I said, when I went in, I was at a place where my kids weren't wanting to talk to me. I was looking through a journal I kept at the facility I was in. I wrote down about my daughter telling me that she hoped that we could get to a place where she wanted me in her life. I couldn't, I was like, oh my God, like that, that is a good reminder. Like I kept that entry because it's a good reminder, and now here we are, like 2.5 years later. Like a year ago, she got married, walking her down the aisle, and we talk all the time. I remember it was not long after she got married, she called me to ask for some advice. in all fairness, she called my wife first, but my wife was busy. But I got a call, and I remember thinking to myself, not too long ago, I was in danger of losing this relationship, and now I'm somebody that she would trust enough to get advice from about how to handle something, and that was huge.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. And shows
no,
how much, can change in a couple of years if you put in the work. Can relate to that completely. My son's a little younger. He's 9, but just a few months ago, like 5, 6 months ago, he didn't even feel safe being around me. I don't think he
no.
vocalized that, but I could tell. And now, we have a great relationship. And just the other day, he told me he's proud of me. I don't think he even understands completely for what, but that means a lot to me. And it's easy, I think, to take those relationships sometimes for granted because you think they're just going to be there forever. I try to remind myself every day that is something I can lose. So you get out of rehab, and I'm sure everyone wants to know what happened after rehab. I think that's a scary time for a lot of people because they go from being in a place where they have some kind of 24/7 support. They're surrounded by fellow addicts in recovery, and then they're just let loose into the world. That's what I felt like happened. I was just put back into the world, and I was like, now what? So how did you build a strong recovery outside of rehab?
Totally relate to that feeling of being scared. I remember when I was leaving, when people were like, "So how are you feeling? You're getting out today?" And I'm like, "I'm really nervous." I was like, I feel great, but when you're in there and you're talking to people that, this is their eighth time, ninth time, that have been in there over and over. And it was the first time I'd been to rehab and done that. Like on my own, I had tried to quit, countless times, and I would last a day. I would last half a day. I remember when it was just alcohol, making it to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sneaking out of the office, getting, vodka, and then patting myself on the back, like thinking like, all right, you made it till 2, you're drinking like a normal person. It was just ridiculous. And I think people told me to put my recovery first, and I needed to build a community of people in recovery. And I like a lot of different programs, be it AA, NA, what is it, Smart Recovery, Recovery Dharma, like whatever it is, like I am pro something. Like you can't do it by yourself. I know that I need other people around me. And so when I got out that night, I went to a meeting and I got a sponsor. And, I left on a Friday, and on Sunday I was meeting with a sponsor and trying to put together, a good support system outside. And so, that's the most important thing for me, for sure.
I think one thing that I didn't fully understand before I went to meetings, I'm very introverted, I'm very shy. And so I do have trouble with, big groups of people. And the thought of talking in front of everyone was just terrifying to me. But it really does feel different at meetings. Everyone has gone through the same shit. Everyone has been at, a really low place. So if you're coming in there at a super low place, you don't have to put on any kind of front or anything. You can just completely be yourself. You can be miserable if you need to at the meetings, and people will just accept you and support you. And, I think that's one of the beautiful things about a meeting. It's not like a party or like a gathering. It's a meeting of fellow addicts in recovery who completely understand and just want to support you.
Yeah, for sure.
So the meetings became a really important part of your recovery. How did you deal with, and how do you deal with the Kratom just kind of being everywhere at gas stations? Did that ever bother you? Did you ever have close calls with that?
Honestly, I know. And it's weird. Since I got out, I went back to the job that I had at that time, and I had worked at that place for 20 years. So 2 decades. My friends at work weren't really communicating with me. And at this time I was, working at home, but I wasn't talking to anyone via Messenger and anything at work. I finally got another job, and when I was about to leave, one of them reached out to me and said, just so you know, the reason nobody has been reaching out to you, is because HR told us not to. that's how toxic like I had made my work environment, that HR was like, hey, don't talk to Jay. It's trouble. So I had gotten to that point there, and like I said, my daughter didn't want to talk to me. We talked earlier about being a big Stephen King fan. I collect first edition Stephen King books, and my oldest one, prized possession one, is The Stand, a first edition, edited version. The first weekend I was in rehab, they gave us our phone back. We had phone time, and I turned my phone on, and I had a text from my 15-year-old, and it was a picture of that book. And it had been opened up, and the pages inside were ripped up. And it had the message, I hope you fucking love this. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I still like sitting here in my office right now, behind me is that copy of the book. I keep it on the top of my bookshelf as a great like visual reminder again of like, this is what your life was like. This is what you're doing. This is what your 15-year-old felt like. And you were talking about your son, telling you he's proud of you, like that 15-year-old, now 17-year-old, he's told me multiple times that he's proud of me and sees such a difference. And so I took a really long roundabout way to get to answering your question. No, like I do see it everywhere. I mean, it is nuts. The amount of shops and signs you see going down the road. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and so it is every couple blocks is a banner that says, hemp, kava, and kratom, and it's just everywhere. And whatever Delta version of that is out. So yeah, I see it everywhere, but no, I haven't had an issue with it.
You have some pretty serious clean time. I know a lot of people would love to hear any advice you have for them if they're just starting their sobriety from kratom, if they're thinking about getting sober from kratom. What advice would you give them?
That you can't do it alone. I'm not a representative of AA, NA, recovery Dharma, any of those things. But I know that, addiction is a very lonely disease. Most of us start doing it because it's fun. Most of us end up alone in doing it. My history was just isolated, and I felt like it was weird. By the end, I was convinced I was an introvert, and that I just wanted to be alone and not bothered by people, and watch horror movies and be miserable. And I still love watching horror movies, but I'm not miserable. No, so it's just the community. It's get out there and and build that up, because when you are getting tempted, if you are having struggles, you need someone to talk to. And there's a reason that these kind of programs, when they work, the reason they work is because people are utilizing that community. I'm not a very magical thinking person, but there is a power in that community, in that love, in that positive energy. If you're sitting, like you were talking about the power of that room, like when you're sitting in a room full of people who have that shared affliction and that shared hope and desire, there's power in that, and there's accountability. And so my biggest advice is just to get involved in some type of recovery, and you have to be ready to get honest. Be honest with yourself and be honest with the people around you.
Yeah, I think being honest with yourself, myself, was one of the hardest parts for me, because my addiction had such a loud voice at the end that I would mistake it for my voice and kind of believe what it said, like, oh, you can just have one of these, this time's different. Like, you can just have a little bit tonight. It will make you feel good. All those things where you really have to find your voice again and really, really be honest. And that's a really hard part, but there are people who can help you do that.
For sure. And I think you nailed it with being your own voice, it sounding like your own voice, because people have this idea in their head of like, of some kind of sinister voice, like trying to coax you into doing this, but no, the voice is, it sounds like you. It sounds like me saying, oh, I could handle this now. Because when you think about it logically, it's like, oh, I haven't used in 2.5 years. Obviously, I've put some time in and I've got space, and now I'm a healthier person. But that's not how it works, at least not for me. And so I know that for 2.5 years, what I've been doing has worked. And so I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing.
And I think you should. Hopefully one day I get 2.5 years. That would be amazing. But right now I'm happy with a little more than 4 months. It feels
4
like
months, yeah,
a lot of time. Yeah.
it is.
I'll take it. So before we go, I did want to ask you, since it is October, if you have any horror movie recommendations for anybody listening. I know I'm putting you on the spot.
No, you're fine. Well, I am a big fan of Long Legs, that just came out. It got a lot of hype, and then it kind of is going through the backlash of, I think, people not feeling like it lived up to the hype. But if you like the more Seven, Silence of the Lambs type, it's a really solid choice. As a child of the 80s, I'm a big fan of all the old school slashers and stuff. So, any of the Halloweens, well, most of them, are always a good option. And this week, my daughter's actually, her and her husband are in town, and so we've kicked off October, and I think so far we've watched Evil Dead Rise. I think the Evil Dead from 2013, you can't go wrong. And like I said earlier, Pet Sematary. Yeah, get some Stephen King.
Those are some solid recommendations. Well, thank you for talking to me, Jay. Is there anything I didn't ask you about or we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about before we wrap things up?
Well, I will say I heard when I listened to a couple episodes of the podcast, I did hear talk of a music festival. And so I did want to say that my wife and I, one of our favorite things to do is to go to live music and go to shows. I know when you're getting sober that can be daunting, the idea of going to a festival or a show. And something I did not know about until I was sober, and someone told me, it was that a lot of concerts and a lot of festivals have different yellow balloon communities. And so if you go to one of these shows, and look out for a table or an area with yellow balloons, because that's going to be people that are representing recovery and sobriety. Like, my wife and I went to Bonnaroo this year. There's such a huge recovery community there. We had 4 meetings a day. And those are great meetings because they're not affiliated with any specific community. It's hey, are you sober, trying to maintain sobriety? Come here, let's talk. And like I said, I'm not a very magical, mystical thinking guy, but a midnight meeting at Bonnaroo with a bunch of sober people from all over the country is one of the most spiritual, events that you can have. And so if you're worried about getting back out there and going to those events, do some research before you go. Find out if there is some form of a yellow balloon community there.
I love that. I didn't know about that. One of the meetings I went to in pretty early sobriety, I was on vacation with my family. So I went to a meeting every day. But there was a meeting like on the beach at sunrise. And it was incredible. Like I was so excited to go to it. And it was just beautiful. And everyone was just chilling on their beach towels. And it was just, I don't know. I'll remember that forever. It was just very magical. It was very cool.
Yeah. Right.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Jay. I'm glad we got to talk about Kratom and about Stephen King. I love him so much, but it was so good to talk to you. And I'm sure people will get a whole lot out of your story and out of your recovery.
Well, yeah, it was great talking to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good week.
Kratom in the headlines. Hi everyone, this is Jacob, and I'm here to bring you our Kratom in the headline segment for this week. So this week we have an article from the Supply Side Supplement Journal, which was formerly known as Natural Products Insider. It's a supplier-related supplement journal covering various things. But this article is entitled Vince Sanders of CBD American Shaman defends 7-OH products. The byline is Move over Kratom leaf and Kratom extracts. Products containing 7-hydroxymetrogenine are in high demand, according to major producer of 7-OH. So just to highlight what the article is focused on at a glance, it talks about this founder from this CBD American Shaman company describing some consumer reports around 7-OH. They highlight some of the positive and life-changing ones, but I think, as you all know, if you go on Quitting Kratom on Reddit or various other forums, you will see a whole litany of horror stories around this product. It also notes that the Global Kratom Commission coalition writes to state attorneys regarding 7-OH products, and that some traditional Kratom firms are, quote, terrified that 7-OH is going to end their business, according to this gentleman, Sanders, from the CBD/Kratom/7-OH company. All right, so a couple things. The article is about 10 minutes long. It's an interesting read. It goes all over the place, from talking about the growth of the 7-OH product, which I didn't realize was just really introduced earlier this year in 2024. Then talks about some experiential reports that are positive, talks about some of the negatives. I'm just going to highlight a few things in here that I thought were of particular interest, and you can read the article for yourselves. But essentially, in the U.S., it notes that tens of millions of products of 7-hydroxymetrogenine, which I'll just refer to as 7-OH from here on out, have been sold this year in the U.S. alone. So again, tens of millions in not even a full year yet of this product have been sold. This gentleman describes the products as mood-enhancing, anti-anxiety, and that it's a safer alternative for people who suffer from opiate addiction. I would disagree. It's just particularly 7-OH, and I'll just focus specifically on that product. I do not think it's a safer alternative. I think it is just another opiate, regardless of if it's a partial or full antagonist, and I'll tell you why in a second. So basically, this gentleman says all that he hears back are positive and life-changing reports. However, the article notes that in June, a group of prominent Kratom researchers, including probably the most prominent Kratom researcher in the world, Dr. Christopher McCurdy, who's a PhD scientist at the University of College Florida Pharmacy and has been at the forefront of Kratom research and is often highlighted by both Kratom advocates and those in the Kratom recovery community just because of his non-biased nature and just expertise in this matter. He states that 7-OH is, quote, more selective for opioid receptors than many of the traditional opioids. It has shown to substitute for morphine in rats that have been trained to self-administer morphine. It also shows a de novo ability to become self-administered by rats, where just sole metrogenine did not show this ability. So it notes that McCurdy, a medicinal chemist, behavioral psychologist, pharmacologist, and pharmacist, notes that therefore it is extremely likely that 7-OH is physically and psychologically addictive with a high potential for abuse. In short, when isolated or heavily concentrated, it should be a controlled substance. That's not the Kratom Sobriety podcast. That's not Jacob. That's not us saying that. That is Dr. Christopher McCurdy, one of the most prominent Kratom researchers on the planet. While this article dances around and highlights all of these, or I wouldn't say all of these, it really just dives into one gentleman's experience who was using 7-OH after a lumbar injury as an alternative to pain medicine, when in reality, he's literally just taking a different form of opiate pain medicine, just a concentrated form that was isolated from the Kratom plant, as opposed to being produced from the opioid poppy or being chemically produced in a lab through reactions. So I could keep going on and on. There's a lot of interesting tidbits in here, but I think the gist of it is that this is a product that continues to be highlighted as problematic, not only from people in the Kratom recovery community, but there are lots of people in the pro-Kratom community that are also pointing out that this product is really strong and on par with some of those other opiates like morphine and potentially hydrocodone, oxycodone. This is not a tea or something to play around with. This is a legitimate chemically produced substance that when taken repetitively and taken often, it has a serious risk factor for addiction and dependence. Buyer beware. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably already aware of 7-OH, maybe have some experience with it. But if you're just using Kratom and you're trying to get off it, run away from this product. That would be my recommendation. But again, we'll link the article in the notes, and this went on a little probably longer than I wanted it to, but that's Kratom in the headlines for this week, and we hope you all have a wonderful week.
Source of the week. This is Charlie. Today I'm going to recommend an episode of a mainstream award-winning podcast that recently tackled the issue of Kratom. It's called Search Engine, and the premise of the show is to take a question from a listener and then do a deep dive onto that subject. This one is called The Mystery of the Vape Shop Kratom, and the host is PJ Vogt. He gets a call from an audience member who unexpectedly, blindsidedly got addicted to a product he bought at a smoke shop, Kratom. He really delves into the information gaps and missing social signals surrounding Kratom. Kratom is a substance that sits in the gray zone, not only legally and in terms of regulations, but also in sorting out the truth about it. One interesting analogy is he compares Kratom to vaping and the industries associated with them. Vaping offered an off-ramp for many people addicted to smoking cigarettes and gave them a much less exposure to lung cancer. But on the other hand, as an unintended consequence, vaping also served as an on-ramp for new people who may have never used nicotine without it. And Kratom has a similar dynamic as a harm reduction choice for some people, but is a horrible first-time addiction for others. Along with the listener who got addicted to Kratom, he interviews scientist Dr. Albert Grudman and counterculture filmmaker Hamilton Morris. The second half of the episode goes into tieptine, which is ironic because Kratom is constantly getting conflated with other gray area drugs, in part because some manufacturers package on occasion Kratom and tieptine and sold them together. So check out the episode. I think it's interesting. It has high production value. So it'll tell you all the areas of improvement that this podcast could, if it was a commercially produced type of show. And until next time, keep it Kratom free.